It's a pleasure to be here with you. And first, I want to congratulate you and President Trump on her coming to the University of Vermont. You couldn't have done better in attracting her to this institution. As she mentioned, she's the chair of the APLU Commission on Economic Community Engagement, and that's not by accident. She's a demonstrated leader in taking a university well beyond the ivory tower and out into the community and actually having a real impact. And that's what we're here to talk about today. You know, some presidents are talkers. Marlene Trump is a doer. She gets things done. And you have an exciting road ahead of you, Marlene, as well as the University of Vermont and the state of Vermont. So I'm so excited for all of you. Also, before I start, I want to give thanks to Tricia Coates, Emma Spett, and Senator Leahy, as well as Kirk Dombrowski, for inviting me here, making this possible. It's really a privilege on my part to be with you today to talk about something that I feel passionately about, as does the organization I represent, the Association of Public and Land-Grant Universities, which is the public importance, the public value in research at our institutions. Not just research for the sake of knowledge, but research for the good of the people. So let's skip that one. So this, like any good play, will be done in 3 acts. We're going to start off with sort of a very modern state of affairs, which is where are we currently as a nation, at least as of 2024, because one of the things you will have to put up with is one of the hazards of having a statistician talk. This will be based in data, not just impressions from reading newspaper articles. But where are we in the state of affair, both in the public confidence and trust in higher education, because that does relate to what we're going to talk about, which is the public value of research. We're also going to talk about public trust and confidence in scientists. What do the American people think in terms of scientists, both in terms of who they are and what they do and what they're good at and perhaps what they're not good at, but also in terms of what is the role in policy and policy making. This will be quite interesting, I think. And then we will go back and we'll go just a hair deeper than President Trump on the Morrill Land-Grant Colleges Act of 1862 to take us back to a different time and then jump us forward to public impact research, a phrase you actually heard in President Trump's remarks. Public impact research is something we use intentionally in a specific way, and we'll talk about that and how that can relate to the conversation you're having here today. So we're going to start off with basically a year ago today, Gallup, I believe in partnership with Lumina, brought forward a continuing series of research reports on public trust and confidence in higher education. And what you see looking at this slide is that public confidence and trust in higher education has been declining, at least since 2015 when they started looking at these kinds of data. You see a particular change in 2023 that may be attributable to the public's perception of how universities responded to events on campuses following the October 7th, 2023 attack of Hamas on Israel. But be that as it may, as to whether or not that was a one-year shift, overall the trends are clear, and they have been persistent for nearly a decade. And this is not good for higher education. And we'll take a little bit of a look at this. Why is this the case? One organization that consistently looks at public value of higher education is actually the Federal Reserve Bank of New York City branch. So the New York Fed every year comes out with a study and doing surveys, and what they tend to focus a lot on is the value or the return of a higher education. Is it worth it to get a college degree? And what the Federal Reserve concluded, and this was, I think, 2023, 2024, is that perceptions of higher education are linked to whether the individuals had to borrow for their education and whether the returns on their education were sufficient for them to repay their student loans. This is something that consistently comes through in surveys, that the value from an economic point of view is actually not debated, but what is debated is it worth it to take out loans to go to college and whether or not you'll be able to repay them. We could do an entire day on just this subject, but we're not going to. But in the Gallup study, they honed in on the people who do not have trust or confidence in higher education. And what they basically say is Americans who lack confidence in higher education today say their concerns lie in colleges pushing political agendas, not teaching relevant skills, and being overly expensive. And when I saw this last year, it hit home for me because I've been in Washington, D.C. 3 years now. I've been a president for 12 and a half years before that. And what had become very clear to me, even though as a nation we talk about the partisan divide, how the government is divided and we can't get together, we don't see much in the way of bipartisan cooperation. But I've been telling people since I got to Washington in 2022 that there is a place where there is a bipartisan consensus in Washington, D.C., and it's about higher education. Now, the way I've been saying it for 3 years is the bipartisan consensus is that higher education is too expensive, it's not teaching what it should be, and it's not producing the workforce America needs. That's not exactly what they said, but it's essentially what the conversation that you do here in the halls of Congress and working with the politicians that are responsible for making the laws in this land. And so it's not exactly this, but it's pretty much spot on. It's about cost, it's about workforce, and then it's a question about whether you call it the political agenda. This was after October 7th, or just a debate over what colleges are teaching or aren't teaching they should be doing. I want to emphasize, though, there's a bipartisan consensus on those three issues. There is not a bipartisan consensus on the solutions to those three issues. So just to cut off a question before it comes, are there differences between Republicans and Democrats on these issues? And when you poll out, you will find differences. However, the other point that I draw from the data is focusing on the difference between Republicans and Democrats is the wrong thing. Okay. First off, in the slide to your left, my right, if you go back to November 2024, a long, long time ago, after the presidential election, you will remember, or you will see if you go back into the archives, that there was a lot of reporting on the differences between Democrats, or college-educated people, and that college-educated people disproportionately vote for Democrats, and non-college educated people and working class people in 2024 voted for the Republican candidate. What's interesting, if you look at these data from the Pew Research Center, is you actually see some trends in time, and you see that college-educated, non-college educated divide is actually focused in a very specific place. So if we look first at high school or less, you see that 6 years ago or 5 years ago, these data are in 2023, but going into 2024, the Republicans used to have a 6-point gap over Democrats and high school graduates. That increased to 8. Some college used to be evenly divided. The Republicans have picked up about 5 points there. On college educated, so it used to be 56-42, so a 14-point gap. That has shrunk to 5. And even postgraduate, which is where the real divide is, it is very clear that people with master's degrees, doctoral degrees, and professional post-baccalaureate degrees, there's a huge divide. But that's the only place you actually see this huge divide. You don't see it among bachelor's degree holders. You see it's 5 points, but that's down from 14. So that's been a shift. But that actually belies the fact that the people who decide the elections in this country are in the other chart. They're the independents. The divide of Republicans, Democrats, progressives, conservatives, MAGA, whatever you want to use it, is roughly about 28 points on each side. Now this is not, so the one on the left is registered vote, or your right, your left is registered voters. The one on the right is how do people self-identify. So this is a survey from the Gallup organization. And you've got about a little over a quarter of people on the left and about a quarter of people on the right. You got 43% in the middle. In other words, there are people out there that you can convince, and this is how you do see the flip-flopping of the White House in this country. Okay. So let's take a look now at public confidence in scientists. The good news is the public generally has a positive view of scientists. The bad news is it has been on the decline, but not in a sort of linear way degrading over a long period of time. what it appears in the data, and we could conjecture a lot about this, and I will a little bit later on, is the pandemic was a big shift for us. In the pandemic, the public, in some sense, had a loss. So we went from a great deal of confidence in scientists, 35, 39%, down into the 20s. It appears, at least comparing 23 to 24, and these are all just single data points, so we've got to be careful. But it doesn't appear that this is just dropping down, but more as there was a shift from the pandemic to after the pandemic. But what's interesting in this Pew Research study is actually what does the public think about the scientists, not in terms of their confidence levels, but their characteristics. So the scientists in the room will be happy. They think you're smart. They think you're highly intelligent, and we would hope so. A little bit less so, think you're skilled in working in teams. About a third don't think you're working on real-world problems, and that's what we're here to talk today about, is real-world problems. That's not necessarily bad, and I'll say something about that later. What more concerning is about a third think that scientists are not honest. That could be a whole nother topic conversation about plagiarism and falsification of data and all sorts of other things that have plagued some areas of scientific research. Then we've got the general public divided on whether or not scientists are socially awkward. Depends which scientists you know. Some are, some less so. Feel superior to others, so that's the ego thing. So a little less than half of the respondents felt that scientists had big egos, feeling superior to others. But the one that sticks out here, and the one that I want to continue on later as we go through this, is less than half the people think that scientists are good communicators. And that is a problem. And that was a problem in the pandemic. That is a problem that has plagued us for a long time. And it's a problem for those of us in universities we have to overcome. It's no good to know the science if you can't explain it to people who aren't scientists, or if you don't have people that can do it for you, because not all scientists want to do that. Won't go into the rest of those. You can see for yourself, though, about a third of the people think scientists are cold, and a little bit less than 30% think they're closed-minded. Okay. This was the real point of the Pew study, and this is just this past fall. This survey was out in the field in the fall of 2024, and that is the debate on should scientists who understand the underlying data and the mechanisms and the systems have a role in forming policy. And this is a really interesting divide because it's almost 50-50. So there is a difference of opinion, and I think the pandemic played into this. Pandemic seems like a long time ago. But for those of us that were responsible for example, running a university at that point, the debate changed almost daily between do we mask, don't we mask, what is social distancing, how far, how many people can go in an elevator, do they need to face the wall, don't they face the wall? They didn't know. We were dealing with a novel coronavirus, which means it was a virus we had never seen the likes of before. Earlier in the introduction, President Trump said at Minnesota, I was given the title of Assistant Vice President for Emergency Preparedness and Response or something like that. That came from the SARS epidemic. Now, SARS seems like a really long time ago, but that was a different novel coronavirus that fortunately did not evolve into a global pandemic, but it did kill a lot of people in Hong Kong. It found its way into Canada and in small parts elsewhere, but it was not nearly as transmissible or as the next coronavirus, COVID-19, proved to be. And the challenge we faced in the pandemic is we didn't know and we never admitted it. We had scientists all the time from the highest levels of the US government at the National Institutes of Health to local physicians, researchers, and universities claiming they knew the answers when they didn't. For example, the current director of the NIH, Dr. Bhattacharya, was a professor at Stanford, wrote something called the Great Barrington Declaration, in which he basically took the government to task for some of the policies they were enacting, and particularly the policies they were enacting relating to children. If you go back and read it as an objective scientist, he and his co-authors were right, but their arguments were wrong. Their arguments were under an assumption that we would get to something called herd immunity. And the basic concept of herd immunity is once a certain percentage of the population is exposed to that particular virus, that the whole population will be immune and you'll never see an outbreak again. Well, it turns out that virus mutates too fast. We'll never get to herd immunity. But nonetheless, he was right. The point is, this is a hot area. It's an issue of communication and an issue of trust in research. So just to summarize this first act, so confidence in higher education has declined. If I put these in rank order, cost and debt is the number one issue, jobs and workforce is second. I'd put liberal bias third, and I put that in quotes because that's the one that is, I think, most malleable and up for debate. On the scientist side, trust has declined, but a lot less than trust in higher education. The pandemic had a particular influence there. And communication is a huge issue, and that's something we need to pay attention to whenever we're talking about research and taking research out into the community, out to the public, and certainly into policy and the roles in policy debates. These are issues that are open and continue to be important. Okay, so President Trump alluded to this. So, you know, we think about our polarization in politics and all the important things you got to get done. Well, your senator, you weren't here, I know, but your senator, Justin Morrill, from the state of Vermont, in 1862, presents to the United States Congress, working in partnership with his co-authors, the Morrill Land-Grant Colleges Act. Excuse me. So basically what the act did, the act's actually very short, and I will actually in the next slide have a quote from the act, but it's a very short document. Unlike legislation today. Today, if you see bills going into Congress, particularly things like the Bill on Reconciliation right now, they're hundreds of pages. This is no more than 2 or 3 pages. And almost all of it is about how the lands were to be given to the states and territories, because there weren't that many states in 1862, and basically for the benefit of agriculture and the mechanical arts. Importantly, this is the first time in our nation's history, and it was a young nation in 1862, but not brand new, where the federal government actually saw a role of the federal government in higher education. And so with this ordinance passing in 1862, Congress established a precedent that the US government would have a role in supporting public education and grow to substantial commitments in later years, and in fact grew to actually support for private higher education. So this is from the National Archives, but let's take a look at the language of the act itself. And I very purposely used different size fonts here. So this is section 4 of the Land Grant Act of 1862. And like I said, it's a very short document. And this is about the only paragraph that actually says why it's done. The majority of the document is the details of how the land's going to be given, what the states can do, what the states can't do. A lot of stuff in that in the regulatory approach. But it basically says the leading object shall be without excluding other scientific and classical studies. Okay, so it didn't say just to do certain things. We're not going to include that, and including military tactics. So today, if you go to just about any land-grant institution in the country, you'll find they have an ROTC program. This is the source of that. To teach such branches of learning as related to the agricultural and mechanical arts. In order to promote the liberal and practical education of the industrial classes and the several pursuits and professions in life. This was about workforce in 1862. And we're still talking about higher education and its role in workforce in 2025. But Senator Morrill put it right there in 1862. The idea is that individuals would get a broad and practical education. Industrial classes, I think today we would probably use working class or average or common people, whatever language you want. But it's the basic idea, as President Trump said, to make higher education accessible to the people, not just to the privileged elite, which was the foundations of higher education in this country and the world at that time. And this all happened when there was more than a bipartisan divide. We were killing each other between the North and the South. In the place where I grew up in the Mid-Atlantic, right on the Mason-Dixon line that divided in a border state of Maryland, we called it the Civil War. I've now lived in the Southeast and now found out it is the War of Northern Aggression if you live down there. And in other parts, it is known as the war between the states. The point is the country was deeply divided to the point of killing people. And yet, Senator Morrill had the foresight to see that the federal government had a role in educating the masses, and educating the masses in practical ways to actually produce results that would make lives better in terms of, in that time, mechanical and agricultural arts. And I would say if you were to write the Morrill Act today, you would probably include the health sciences, you would include various other disciplines above those, but in that time, those were the relevant cases. Okay. And I think importantly, this act was around a specific set of institutions. And every state in the country has a land-grant institution, and every US territory has a land-grant institution. Okay. APLU has roughly 250 members. About over 220 of those are in the United States, the rest are in Canada and Mexico, or associations. Only about a third of our members are land-grant institutions. But as an organization representing all the public research universities in America, this is our ethos. As an organization, we were founded out of these colleges back in 1887 because of the land-grant colleges that existed in the 1800s came together, the deans, first of the College of Agriculture, then the presidents, and that eventually becomes the Association of Public and Land-Grant Universities many years later. But the idea is at our ethos is that these public institutions like the University of Vermont and the other 220, 230 public research universities in America exist for a public purpose. Not as just towers of science and knowledge, but as a place where people can get a real and practical education to improve society, to improve lives for others. So let me go to the third and final act before we go to Q&A. Public impact research. So at APLU, we've been very involved in this. President Trump herself has been involved. This is the cover off a 2019 report on public impact research produced by APLU. You can find it at our website. If you just Google APLU Public Impact Research, it will take you to this. This is a document that sort of basically lays out some of the principles. And I will say that even though the date is 2019, this is still fresh and alive. As recently as last year, and I think it will continue through this year, even though there's been a few side bumps in the road, the National Academies has been convening various associations on groups continuing to push the importance of public impact research. So in the report, it basically says that university research improves lives and serves societies. Again, that's our ethos out of the Morrill Land-Grant Act. But it doesn't say in place of basic research. It says that using public impact research consistently along with fundamental discovery, because without fundamental discovery, we don't get applied research. We don't get applications to real problems in the world. And the training of the next generation workforce, again, that ethos of the Morrill Act. It's incredible what Senator Morrill did in terms of laying out an ethos that lives with us. The next generation workforce communicates, the importance of communication, yet again, powerfully the public value of university research. Now, the report itself breaks things down into 5 important action steps. The first is just that we actually talk about public impact research. It's not something to be ashamed of. It's not something to be hidden. It's not something to be kept off to the side. It's something that we need to talk about, and we need to do this work purposely. In other words, universities within their research mission need to have parts of the university that are focused in this way. Not every part, there's still fundamental discovery. But to do this work, you have to engage stakeholders. That's what today is about, that's what this program is about, is engaging stakeholders, communicating about with public impact research to stakeholders, and then fifth, building specific campus and stakeholder structures and policies to encourage public impact research. For those of you that don't live in the research university world, there's a lot of things to incentivize you not to do this work. And what this report is basically saying is we need to acknowledge that, and as institutions, within our own context, within our own states, our geographies, our missions, our opportunities, is take that up and figure out how to support this work at the same time that we're supporting all the other things that universities do. So for the better part of the last 20 years, I've had a habit of basically paying attention to what the media writes about. This was largely because I was a dean of School of Public Health at the University of Minnesota. And as somebody who had spent his faculty career in public health and then becoming a dean at the University of Minnesota, a state like Vermont where everybody's engaged in the citizenry, and you start paying attention to what do people care about. And this is basically the four things that resonate in the media time in and time out. On any given day, there's going to be a world crisis, and that crisis will be in the media. Back out the crises. Consistently, the articles that get the most attention, in national media in particular, but local as well, is the economy. People care about the economy, they care about their pocketbooks. It has a huge impact on the outcome of elections. And in the world of universities, that's about innovation and technology, continuing to drive economic prosperity. You have to continue to innovate, and the development of new technologies has always been a driver of the economy, and that continues to this day. The reason I was following it, because I always thought that health should be the number one thing, because I was a dean of public health, and that's what our faculty did and our students did. And there, people really do care a lot about extending and improving life. That is a consistent, durable theme. National security is much farther behind those two, but certainly there's a strong interest in making sure that we have secure, safe borders and that the U.S. is prepared to defend itself under all circumstances. And then there's the agriculture piece. This is almost an afterthought, even though it was at the core of the Morrill Act. Americans expect to be able to give food, that the food they eat will not hurt them or kill them, and that it's affordable. So we're all the way back to the economy again. Those are the main things that get the interest of the media. So when we talk about public impact research, on our website where that report is, there's a list of pages with lots of examples. I will only say now the University of Vermont and the Leahy Institute need to send their examples so we can put those up on our website as well. This is just one I grabbed quickly around fueling economic resilience and sustainability in the eastern U.S. forests. This would be relevant here as well. This particular study, it's interesting because Purdue is not in the east, but Purdue is the one that got the big grant from the U.S. Department of Agriculture, but in partnership with your partners to the north in Maine and to the south in Georgia. But you heard Tricia Coates in her introduction talking about the things happening here. They all fit in this same space. Work in multiple ways around the hazards of floods, whether it's looking at mapping of hazards, whether it's studying real-time monitoring of weather so that we can give better alerts, protect people from floods when they happen, whether it's evaluating Vermont's community schools model. Evaluation is a huge part of research that's relevant to this crowd. Colleges of education, schools of public health, medical schools not only do research trying to discover new things, they spend a lot of time evaluating, have evaluation research methods in terms of what actually works. What works in health systems, what works in education systems, what works in government programs. And you have that going on right here in Vermont with the support of the University of Vermont. And then you've got the power grid. In an AI world, there's an insatiable appetite for electricity. I live in Northern Virginia, just outside of Washington, D.C., in the greatest concentration of data centers in this country. The number 2 concentration of data centers in this country is just north of Atlanta, where I used to live. And the drain and the power on the grid to be able to support the lifestyle that we live today and where we're headed with AI and the demand for massive data centers to be able to not only organize data, but to be able to use those data to make decisions and gather information in real time in ways that are well beyond the sophistication of what we're used to. Huge threats to the power grid. Where I live, I haven't experienced it yet, but they keep talking about the possibility of rolling brownouts, that the draw from the data centers will be so great that the homes and the other businesses aren't going to get their electricity. Again, this is an area where the University of Vermont is working locally here in Vermont to look at the power grid and where the risks are and where the hazards are. That's public impact research. Now, the last piece I want to talk about is a very specific area of public impact research, and that's community-based participatory research. This quote is actually from an article that was published in the journal Stroke in 2019. I actually first came to this field in the mid-1990s when I was a faculty member at the University of Michigan in public health, because we had faculty in the university who were pioneers in this area in the field of public health. So most of the examples you will see in public impact research, whether you look at the University of Vermont website or whether you look at the APLU website, are about universities working with governments, working with systems. This is about working with people. There is actual research opportunities where, in very specific types of cases, to find the solutions. When you go into the community, it's not that you're coming in with the experts, but you're sitting down at the table, actually helping identify the problem at the community level. This is hard work. This takes a lot of time. The community helps actually define the research questions, works in partnership with the researchers from the institution, conducts the research, doing all the monitoring, the data security, the data analysis, the data cleanliness, communicates the results, not just in the language of faculty and professors, but communicates the results in the language of the community, okay, in a very different language than professors are used to. And in many cases, if it is an ongoing study, maintains that relationship for decades and decades. So community-based participatory research is a very specific example, not applicable in all cases, but there is a literature and there are examples. But as I said, this came to me in the mid-1990s. This is an area where we're still struggling because this is really hard and it doesn't work at the pace at which university researchers are used to working. But there are unique opportunities here to do things in a completely different way and actually do transformative work at the local level. And there are certainly scholars, researchers, faculty members, graduate students, undergraduates who want to do this work. And that's back to the public impact research recommendations. We have to make sure there's a place for that kind of work and those researchers within our institutions to support this kind of work. So to wrap it up and go to Q&A, public research is a public good. You know, this is not new. Let's say Senator Morrill, right here in Vermont, had this figured out 163 years ago. Research in higher education should be for the public, not just for the elites, and not just for their personal edification. But we've got to regain trust and confidence. And one of the ways to do that is through public impact research, to show that institutions are not detached from the public, not detached from the community, but are actually doing research for the benefit of the public. In order to do that well, we have to engage with the community, whether it's at the level of community engaged participatory-based research, or whether it's more of the partnerships between governments, public entities, private entities, whatever the larger entities may be. And the real piece is communication. We have to keep working on communication. I'd like to say that artificial intelligence would make us better communicators, I'm not sure we're there yet, but I can tell you that as an example of the potential, I'm a statistician. There are a large percentage of the faculty in my field do not have English as their first language. And I was at first surprised, but then not, to learn that when large language models or ChatGPT came out, that one of the first applications was by faculty who did not have English as their first language to write the abstracts and introductions of their papers using ChatGPT so that they could improve their communication. I don't think ChatGPT is not going to save us from ourselves, but it is a tool. But we really need to focus down on communication, and then the humility piece. A big part of the problem right now that we're facing is we lost some trust and confidence in research and science in the pandemic because we claimed to know the answers when we didn't know the truth. We didn't know them. We overemphasized the importance of specific little areas of research, not understanding bigger systems. So focusing on a virus instead of a community, impact on learning in children. We need more humility amongst the geniuses and the scholars. We need to communicate better. We need to be humble, and we need to serve the people. Thank you very much. I think we have a few minutes for questions or comments. So we'll get
questions. Ooh, hello. We have about 10 minutes for questions. You can either choose to come to one of the 3 microphones. I'm standing at one. Michelle, raise your hand. Is another one? And then there's a third right over there. Please ask questions and keep the comments to a minimum. And we'll cut you off when we run out of time.
Hi. I'm curious, when you do this public impact research and you collaborate with community members, is your goal to better understand, or is it actually to take some action that moves the community forward?
Yeah, great question. And I will say that one of the first things I had to do as Dean of School of Public Health was communicate to my faculty we were not the health department. The state of Minnesota had its own health department. We were not there to replace them. So to your point, it actually was a dual mission, both to understand and to hopefully have an impact. So the case, first example I remember where I encountered this work was in the suburbs, in parts of Detroit, extremely impoverished community where high levels of dust in the home led to all sorts of bad health outcomes, asthma, various other respiratory diseases. And on top of that, rat feces and other things in homes. So to understand what was making people sick, they eventually found it was the dust, the mold, the rat feces, and other materials. But one was to understand why were these children in particular so sick and manifesting conditions that were abnormal. But then secondarily was to ameliorate the situation. So this was an example where you had community health researchers partnering with environmental health researchers, and that's another characteristic of this work. These are big interdisciplinary teams. This is not 5 physicists, it's not 5 health evaluators. They tend to be multidisciplinary teams because solving the real problem is going to require more than one person. But you're exactly, it's both, not one or. Yep, over here.
Yeah, could you perhaps speak a bit about your perspective on the future of liberal arts at universities and research in the humanities and history and so on?
Get that question all the time. Imagine that. Yeah, so the liberal arts are hugely important. Look, I'm a STEM person. I have a PhD in statistics, a bachelor's degree in math, a minor in physics. The most impactful course in my undergraduate education, other than my mathematics training, was modern drama, which was actually a literature course, not an acting course, because I have no talent for acting. But these were the playwrights of the early 20th century, Brecht, Chekhov, Ibsen, et cetera. And, for example, learn about storytelling, learn about, I won't even go into it because this is Marlene Trump's specialty. She comes from the liberal arts, from the humanities. But it's hugely important. I sent my own kids to liberal arts colleges. I think that's sort of, in here is that at the end of the day, at most of these institutions, the vast majority of the students are out to get a job. And if their parents are paying for tuition, they want them to get a job. But to be effective in society and to be effective leaders, effective problem solvers, you need to have a very broad education. And the liberal arts are at the center of that. There is going to be a subset of the student population who's going to want to go on and specialize in that area. Some people specialize in Victorian era poetry. That's a good thing. They go on to be university presidents, do great work in community economic engagement. So I don't think this in any way devalues that. But I do know that some of my colleagues feel like they're being devalued when we talk about this work in the way that I just did. Yes.
Hi. We're talking about research as a public good in an environment where the entire public underpinning of research is under attack. Can you talk a little bit about how APLU is organizing to protect and defend research in the public interest as well as public access to higher education?
Yeah, so talk about public impact research in APLU. As an organization, we have really three major, I'll call them buckets of work that we do. Public advocacy is our number one priority. Certainly I personally spend more of my time on matters of public advocacy. And when I say public advocacy, that's our role in working with both the House, the Senate, and the administration or the White House. Rarely work with the president directly, usually working with members of the cabinet or undersecretaries or assistant secretaries, the various organizations. Within the last few months, since January 20th, for the first time in our history, APLU has sued the federal government. We had never sued anybody before, and again, we date back to 1887. We hadn't sued anyone. I am now the sign on the complaints to sue the National Institutes of Health, the Department of Energy, the National Science Foundation, and as of yesterday, U.S. Department of Defense. Because the federal government, in our opinion, and we believe that the law will stand with us, and it has so far, that actions taken by the federal government not to reimburse universities for the cost of conducting research, which is an arcane area called facilities and administrative cost, or to faculty known as indirect costs. The government basically wants to say, well, we just want to do something differently. In this particular case, it is clear to us that the way they've done it is illegal, and we've filed in court 4 times so far. We've gotten what we've sought as a temporary restraining order or a permanent injunction against the rule changes at NIH, then DOE, then NSF, and hopefully what we filed yesterday on DOD will follow. Now, that seems simple, and we will probably win those cases, even though it's impossible to know what will happen if or when one or more of them gets to the Supreme Court. But that's not the whole game of what we do. So at the same time that that is taking place, we are supporting, as a part of a larger group, and I should say those lawsuits are in partnership with the American Association of Universities and the American Council on Education. So the 3 of us have joined together in all those, as well as with some institutions. In every case, we have institutions filing. But at the same time, we're also working to come up with a new system. Because the reality is there is a bipartisan consensus here too, which is the current way that the US government reimburses institutions for the cost of supporting research is opaque and subject to perhaps some mischief, perhaps. So there's a group that's led by Kelvin Drogemeyer, who works at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, another land-grant, another APLU member, working with subject matter experts from across the field of research to come up with a new system that is more transparent, that does reimburse universities for the cost of doing the research, but not in the ways that have basically become a focal point for the administration and for the Republican Party more generally. So that piece is in work, and we are working with actually working with the administration on that work, as well as with the House and the Senate. So this is a big part of just trying to maintain the enterprise, maintain the research infrastructure. Because if we do not prevail, budgets are going to have to be cut, and there's not going to be able to support this work. So there's that piece. Another piece is the cancellation of grants. We are not the plaintiffs in those cases, but we've filed amicus briefs. And yesterday in Boston, Judge Young ruled that the government was arbitrary and capricious in canceling their grants and that they should be reinstated. So now we wait to see if the government appeals. The interesting thing in all these cases is the arguments are the same. I've either been in the courtroom or watching the arguments on Zoom, and it comes down to something called the Administrative Procedures Act. And there's a few key cases that people talk about, but our argument is that they violated their own rules and they've been arbitrary and capricious. But that doesn't protect it, because here's the reality. On the F&A costs, if the federal government wants to change from what they have been doing since the Second World War, the current structure dates back to the 1940s. And university research has been fundamental to the U.S. economic prosperity and national security coming out of the Second World War. And you know, you can see all the technology, all the innovation, everything that's been done. That partnership back to then, all they need to do to change it is issue something called a notice of public rulemaking, say we're going to do it a different way. There will be a comment period, and anybody who's ever been through this knows when the comment period's over, if there isn't consensus, they can do whatever they want. So the reason that we're in court is to keep them from arbitrary and capricious right now, but it's not a one-pronged strategy. It's also working with leadership in the House, leadership in the Senate, and working with the White House to come up with a solution that actually that keeps research universities able to do the research for the good of the public, for the good of the American people. I think we're, yeah. Okay.
Thank you so much, Dr. Becker. Unfortunately, we are out of time for Q&A, but so appreciate it. Thank you so much.